So this is a purchasing and construction policy update, and I think it is both timely and important to be talking about it tonight. And the best evidence of that is how it relates to some of the other important items that have been talked about on tonight's agenda. The technology refresh that Dustin just talked about had over $2 million worth of purchasing involved with it. The executive limitation 2.6 Asset Protection Policy Monitoring Report that Dave Montoya will talk about after I'm done is directly related to purchasing. The long-range planning construction projects that were talked about earlier tonight involve, amongst other things, recently authorized $375 million bond issue. All of that is purchasing. And then Dave Montoya talked earlier about the budget challenges that the district is facing. All of those things sort of require a thoughtful and tight budget policy that provides for the best use of district funds. Now, a couple things that I want to talk about. In your board packets are copies of the current versions of the policies. And what I'm going to do after I make a few introductory remarks is actually step through those and at sort of a 30,000-foot level highlight some of the important parts of each of the policies. But the first thing that I want to point out before we get to that is that it is true that the policies were recently revised, but it is not true that the substantive terms of the policies have changed. Basically, the substantive terms of the policies are virtually the same as they have been for the past decade. What's happened with the recent revisions is emphasis and clarification of the policies that have been in place over the last 10 years to make sure that everyone's on the same page as we proceed with our purchasing and with the new construction that's coming down, to make sure that everybody's on the same page and following the policies. The purpose of them is to ensure fiscally responsible purchases and to provide for accountability in the process. I do want to say that these policies do reflect a collaborative effort across the administration. In the first place, the way these were refined is that representatives of the Finance, Purchasing, Planning, Design, and Construction, and Facilities Department all reviewed these, provided input, and we did make changes based on those over several meetings. In addition, Dave Montoya, the Executive Director of Finance, hired an outside consultant. The name of the firm is Purchasing Advantage, and they've come in and reviewed the district's purchasing policies, procedures, and practices to help tighten those up and ensure that the district's spending the money well. I met with those people along with Dave and our purchasing manager, Skylar Thiemens, and these policies reflect their input. In addition, the entire cabinet has reviewed these policies, and I met individually with the superintendent before she finally approved the revisions to them. And I can say that at the end of that process, this is not always the case, but at the end of that process, I'm not aware of any objections or concerns regarding the policy language here. So I think it's fair to say that moving forward, at least with respect to the language of the policy, the administrators are on the same page, and I want to make sure that the board understands what we're doing with those. So I'm just going to go through them in order, starting with policy DJ. We have 3 purchasing policies and 2 construction policies that we're highlighting tonight. Policy DJ is basically an overview of the purchasing process. And if you look at the highlighted language at the top of this slide, this language is at the top of the policy, not only DJ, but also DJA and DJB. The reason for this is it is that important that we want to emphasize the fact that the definition of purchasing is not just using a purchasing card, cash, or a check and either getting a good or service. Right now, if somebody orders something online or signs a contract and another part of the organization pays for it and yet another one takes delivery of it, a lot of times the people who place the order or sign the contract aren't really plugged into the fact that that is a purchase, and that is covered by these policies. And so we wanted to emphasize that up front here. With respect to the second paragraph on this slide, the highlighted language basically says two things that happen if a purchase is made, or that can happen if a purchase is made in violation of the policies. The first thing is that the purchase is voidable. And what that means is that it's not automatically void. Rather, what it means is the district has the option of telling the vendor, look, the person who made this purchase didn't follow our policies. We don't want to go through with it. It's void. We are not going to complete that process. The other consequence of a purchase in violation of the policies is possible discipline for the person who's violated it. Moving on through District Policy DJ, the thing to highlight here in the second paragraph on this slide is that for all purchases of goods and or services of $5,000 or more, two things are required. This hasn't always happened in the past. I think everyone's getting on the same page for it to happen. The first of the two things that has to be in place is a purchase order has to be issued by the purchasing department. And all the purchase order is a number, and it helps finance department keep track of the purchase, and it also helps the different departments keep track of the information and documents associated with the purchase. That might be bids, it might be responses, it might be bid tabulations, it might be contracts. So the purchasing order is really a tool for keeping track of the purchase and what's involved with that. The second thing that all purchases of $5,000 or more requires is a contract, and there's two kinds of contracts we have. The first one is the standard terms and conditions that typically go with our purchase order. It's the default, and in the olden days, and I remember these very well, on hard copies, on the front page of a purchase order was actually the purchase order. You turned it over and looked at the fine print on the back. That's the boilerplate terms and conditions. That's what applies to standard purchases that don't have more unique aspects that need to be separately and individually dealt with a contract. So we either use the boilerplate terms and conditions, or we draft contracts for the specific transactions. So we need all of those things for purchases of $5,000 or more. The other highlighted portion here that I want to call your attention to, the second one on this slide, is that there are occasions where purchases of less than $5,000 do require a purchase order. They don't require a contract, so they only require half of that two-part process referred to in the prior paragraph. And an example of that, getting back to technology that we just talked about, even if you can buy a tablet or a laptop or something for well below $5,000, the district does not authorize anybody with purchasing authority up to $5,000 to go to Walmart or Best Buy or some other place and buy a laptop. Rather, what they need to do is use the purchase order, because there is economies of scale in our purchasing through the technology department, and so they would purchase it using that. So there are certain things that are on record with purchasing where they're supposed to use the purchase orders for under $5,000. Continuing on policy DJ, the highlighted language at the top of this slide is probably the most important language. This top sentence is probably the most important of all the 5 policies I'll be talking about. And basically, what that boils down to is that every employee in the district that makes a purchase has a fiduciary duty to act in the best interest of the district when they're making that purchase. And that includes consideration of best possible terms and conditions, price, quality, warranty guarantees, support and overall value. All of those things have to be taken in, and as I'll highlight as I get into different policies, this language applies to all of the policies and all of the decisions that are made in purchasing. So again, it's not just uninformed discretion for doing it. Every purchase and every action in connection with that has to be in the best interest of the district. The language that's highlighted at the end of that top paragraph there is something that's often overlooked, but I want to point out. That is that the district is exempt from most sales taxes, and a lot of money can be left on the table if that's not kept track of, and that the people making the purchase aren't using the district's tax-exempt ID numbers for those. And that's particularly the case when you have individuals authorized to make purchases of under $5,000 where they're not working through the purchasing department, or they're getting reimbursed for a personal cash outlay. Oftentimes that gets lost and the district's paying sales taxes, and that does add up over time. There's a lot of purchases under $5,000 that aggregate to a lot of dollars, and that means the sales taxes can add up too. Finally, the last thing I want to call attention to in this slide, the highlighted language at the top of the third paragraph, has to do with grants. And all I really want to say about that is when the district receives grant money and then turns around and spend it, that spending of that money is covered by these purchasing policies. It's not separately covered by the grants to the exclusion of these purchasing policies. It's covered by these purchasing policies plus any additional terms and conditions that may be imposed by the grant. And so that's something that needs to be kept in mind. And I can tell you that I've been informed that Schuyler's been working with Ginger Haberer and Stacy Ponsolo, who's our grants person, to ensure that the grants side of things are keeping in mind the purchasing policies, and that the purchasing department is working with the grants people to make sure that they are properly going through the process in compliance with grant requirements. Moving on to district policy DJA, this isn't a general policy. This has to do with purchasing authority, and by authority what we're talking about is who is authorized to make purchases based on the dollar amounts involved. The highlighted portion here points out something that I think the board's well aware of because it's reflected in one of your executive limitations policy, and that is that board approval is required for all purchases of $250,000 and more. But what this, after the first sentence, what this paragraph goes on to point out is that in the judgment of the superintendent or the executive director of finance, purchases for less than $250,000 may, if they deem it appropriate, also be taken to the board just because they think that it's something of importance that either requires the board's judgment or that some other district policy might require that it go to the board. A good example of that is, as you know, all real estate transactions have to be approved by the board. Water rights can often be purchased for less than $250,000, but the law on water rights transactions is considered real property law, so the Board of Education would have to approve that. Same thing if we were purchasing an easement to run a pipe or wires or conduit across someone else's property. That would be brought to the board too. Also, controversial materials in curriculum or something, we might be purchasing something that's less than $250,000, but the superintendent or executive director may want to get the board's input on whether that's a good idea under the circumstances. The top two highlighted portions of this slide basically point out who within the district has authority to purchase up to $250,000, and there's only 3 people in the district that can do that: the superintendent and the 2 guys sitting there, the executive director of finance and the purchasing manager. Only 3 people can do that. The third highlighted portion of this slide points out that the purchasing manager, Schuyler Thiemens, has the authority to delegate to people within his department the authority to purchase for up to $100,000, and currently there are 3 buyers with that authority. Everyone else is covered by the last highlighted section in the last paragraph here, and it primarily applies to administrators, office managers, and financial department personnel, and that's authority to purchase up to $5,000. That's the authority I have. That's the authority that everyone on cabinet has except Sandra and Dave Montoya. We only have authority up to $5,000. That's all principals have. It's pretty low, which means anytime we go above $5,000, it's supposed to go through the purchasing department. Two things to note at the very end of policy DJA. The top item here, which is highlighted, basically this is the no gamesmanship rule. If I have purchasing authority, or let's say that an office manager has purchasing authority up to $5,000 and they want to buy a good or service for $8,000, they can't divide it into two purchases of $4,000 each and call it good. What the purchasing department will do is look at the facts and circumstances of the case and say, you bought the same stuff, you just placed two orders of the same thing on consecutive days, spent $8,000. That was designed to circumvent this authority. It should have gone to the purchasing department. That's a violation of this policy. The last paragraph here is something, this is one of those we wanted to emphasize something that you'd think would be apparent, but sometimes it wasn't to everyone. And that is basically going back to our office manager example again. That person has purchasing authority under this policy up to $5,000. What this paragraph says is, nevertheless, even though you have that purchasing authority under this policy, if your supervisor says, no, we're not going to buy that, that controls. Before the purchase, you still got to listen to your supervisor. Now we've talked about purchasing authority, now we're talking about purchasing procedures. And as I've alluded to before, the highlighted section at the beginning of the second paragraph here basically says that all purchases of $5,000 or more have to be coordinated through the purchasing department. I've already said it, but that's something that we're doing better at now than we have been, but this has to happen for all of those purchases. And the way the coordination works is basically this. It's a little bit oversimplified, but I think it's pretty accurate. The purchasing department's role for those purchases is essentially to facilitate the procedures and to handle the procedures and to ensure that the procedures are properly executed. The role of the individual or the department or the school that wants to make the purchase is to make the substantive determination, is this something we really need? Is the quality right? Does it meet our needs? Those sorts of things. And it requires these people working together, purchasing working together with these individuals, departments, and schools, and vice versa, to make it work right, because they each have a role in the process. The schools and the others that are making the purchases aren't the experts in how to do this. The purchasing department is, so they will handle the procedures and let the other people focus on what they need and making sure they get it. There's lots of stuff highlighted on here, but it all boils down to one thing, and that is that going through these procedures, it is not required that the people making the purchase buy the thing with the lowest price. What is required is that price be considered. It also requires that if let's say that we have bids on something and someone doesn't take the lowest price, it requires justification for not taking the lowest price. It's penny wise and pound foolish. Cheaper is not always better, and in many cases, cheaper is worse. That's why it's cheaper. But we still want to look at all the prices and consider that, and if someone's not buying the thing that's the cheapest, they're supposed to justify that. And a good example that didn't happen too long ago with the Board of Education, Pete can probably help me with this a little bit if I get it wrong, but it wasn't too long ago that there was a transportation vehicle purchase that was brought in front of the Board of Education, and in the bid tabulation it was pointed out that it wasn't the lowest price vehicle that was taken. I think it was the second lowest. It was close. I think it was like within $400 or so. But basically, there were good reasons that the Transportation Department had for buying that item, and that's perfectly okay. What's not okay is just sort of randomly buying things without a good reason for what you're picking. But price has to be considered, but it's not the only consideration. Now we have the actual procedures based on the cost to purchase for how we decide what we're going to buy. And as you'll note here in the parentheses, the first highlighted portion at the end of the paragraph there, it says that the procedures that are required for purchasing higher dollar amount things can be used for the lower dollar amount things. So in this case, item number 1 talks about what procedures are required for purchases of up to $5,000, and the answer is you don't have to use those procedures. There's considered to be de minimis benefit going through those procedures for those low dollar amount. It doesn't mean that they can't, whoever's doing the purchasing, can't use the procedures. It just means that it's not required. Item number 2 there, this is the price quotes, and that's for dollar amounts $5,000 up to $50,000. And then the third purchasing method is for items of $50,000 and up, either competitive bidding or competitive proposals. And we'll talk about a little bit more specifics in these in subsequent slides, which are subsequent parts of this policy, DJB. The last thing I want to highlight on this slide, though, just like with purchasing authority of individuals, our office manager with purchasing authority up to $5,000 can't split an $8,000 purchase in two and bring it within her authority. The same thing's true with respect to which procedure you use. You can't split the purchase to use a different procedure. You have to consider it based on all the facts and circumstances as a whole. So looking at each of these procedures, the first one is the documented price quotes. The first thing that's required here that I want to highlight, and it's the first highlighted portion, is that the quotes that are received, and this is done by the purchasing department, need to be in writing. Now the purchasing department, as I pointed out, doesn't have that many people in it. They can work with others outside to do this. That would be up to Schuyler and how he wants to work with the other schools, departments, and individuals. But whoever does it has to get the quotes in writing, and that's so we have the documentation of how the decision was made. The second thing that's highlighted here, and this is important, and it's a theme that'll carry through the next few slides, is that at least 3 qualified vendors have to have the price quotes got from them. But the important thing here is that this is an absolute minimum. You can't buy it unless you have this much. And remember, when I talked about before the fiduciary duty of the person doing the purchasing to act in the best interest of the district, that includes getting, in this case, price quotes from as many people within reason as possible, because the theory is the more quotes you get, the better chance you have at a good price, the more different options you have to choose from, and the more new things that you might get that you didn't even consider were available from the different vendors. So the general rule with respect to price quotes is that within reason, more is better. And so when things come to the Board of Education or different department heads or finance director and purchasing department, a question that should be asked, if you're given a bid tabulation that only has 3 quotes on it, question is, are you telling me that there are no more than 3 people that would give a quote in this? And if what was done was simply picking 3 because that's the easiest thing to do, that is not how this policy is supposed to work. The last thing is, item C here that I've highlighted, is that the purchasing department does maintain the documentation of all these purchases, so if there are questions or disputes, that they can go back and look at the documents to explain why it was done. For competitive bidding process, the difference between competitive bidding and competitive proposals, which we'll talk about in the next slide, is important. Basically, a competitive bidding process is when the district knows exactly what it wants and gives the vendors our specifications. It's stuff that we can describe exactly what we want done and how we want it done. And so then the highlighting here in section B, that allows us to also say, in addition to bidding, is that this is the terms of the contract. We know what the terms of the contract can be up front, except for the price item, because we have specified how it's going to be done. A good example of that would be we want different properties' lawns mowed. We don't need anything other than a price on that, and so in general, that's an example of something that we would probably just do a competitive bid on as opposed to a competitive proposal. We know exactly what we want and how we want it done. All we want to do is see how much people out there will do it for. And again, the last thing that's highlighted here within item D is that rule, that theme that I told you about. Within reason, more is better in terms of the bids that we get. Finally, the competitive proposal process. This is a case where the vendors make proposals on how they can meet the district needs. A good example of that is last year we had a math curriculum purchase that the board approved. And that's not a case where the district sat down and said, we're going to tell all the vendors, the publishing houses and whatnot, exactly what curriculum we want. Rather, we put some criteria in place, like it's got to meet the state standards. We want to have teacher training. We want to have textbooks for teachers as well as students and so forth. We put in those criteria, and then we ask all the vendors that we sought proposals from to tell us, okay, how can you best meet our needs? And then a team of educators got together and evaluated all those, and yes, they looked at price, but they also looked at who had the best deal, who had the best plan, who had the best services. That's different from the competitive bidding process where we already know all that stuff and we're just looking for price. Here we're looking for help with how it's going to be done, what we're going to get. Second highlighted portion, last time I'll beat this horse until the next time I do it. Within reason, more is better. We want to get as many proposals as we can. That's helpful. And the last point, which I kind of alluded to in the prior slide, is that because we don't know what the process is that we're ultimately going to get, or what the goods are going to look like, or how the services are going to work, we're going to have to end up writing that after we select the vendor. We have to describe what it is that they're offering to us. But there are some things that we can specify and do specify up front, and using the example of the math curriculum purchase that I just mentioned, we used the student data privacy language that we require. That was something in the request for proposal we sent out and said whichever vendor we choose has to comply with this, and I can tell you that each of the vendors did. Now, there are exceptions to these processes that I just talked about, and as you can see in the first highlighted section there, the ones I'm going to talk about first are exceptions not to the purchasing authority in dollar amounts, the $250,000 and the $100,000 and down to $5,000. This is an exception to that. This is an exception to the procedures that I've just talked about in this policy DJB. And the first exception has to do with construction projects. It's not a big exception, but they're treated just a little bit differently. And the two areas that I want to highlight, and we'll talk about a little bit more later because there are two construction policies that I'm going to go over in just a minute. But basically that is the contracts. The contracts that are used in the construction process are ones that are developed by the American Institute of Architects, AIA, as modified by our Planning, Design, and Construction Department. And those are then reviewed by legal counsel, and either the Facilities Department or the Planning, Design, and Construction Department then use the pre-approved forms of contract and just fill in the missing information for the various construction projects. That's different from other purchasing processes that we talk about. That's somewhat unique to construction. The other thing that's somewhat unique is this project pre-qualification. We have a whole separate policy on that, FEAA, but the idea is that before either contractors or design professionals like architects or construction managers provide submit bids or proposals or price quotes, that they have already been vetted by either the facilities department or the planning, design, and construction department to make sure that they have the ability to do the job if they're ultimately selected. Two more of the exceptions are on this slide that's currently up. The first one is actually a substantive change that we did make from the original policies. Now, I did say at the outset that essentially what we've done is emphasize and clarify existing policies and didn't really make any changes. This section regarding educational equipment, materials, and services is new. And the reason for that is this. This is a school district whose primary mission is to educate kids. The purchasing tail should not wag the educational dog in terms of making decisions about what's the best education for kids. So what this says is that if there's a disagreement at the end of the day, either the superintendent or one of the assistant superintendents can override purchasing and basically say, we're going to take a particular service or goods or combination of goods and services because we think that's best for students' education regardless of these processes. Now, I can tell you what's happened since Schuyler's been working with the educators, and I think that they're a little bit excited about this because we're starting to get some synergy going here. The educators may have an idea of, I know this is good, I know I want it, I want to bypass this process. Schuyler says, why don't you just let me put it out, just let me post it and see what we get back. And in some cases, they get back, hey, you can get two of those things for what you wanted to pay for the price of one, and it's every bit as good as what we had thought we were getting with this other one. Or, hey, we didn't even know this other thing was offered that this person that responded brought in. This is great. This is better education than we thought we were getting. So in working together cooperatively like I've been talking about, we have been getting better deals for the district, not only in terms of the quality of the goods and services, but also better prices. Sole source items, that's another exception. This is something that is pretty rare. Basically, and it should be getting rarer. Basically, what it's defined as is something that's unique, that's only available from a particular vendor, one particular vendor, because of things like that vendor has a patent on the goods, they have unique expertise, perhaps in terms of services. There's no technology, or they're the only ones, I'm sorry, there's no competition, or they're the only ones that have a particular technology. It occasionally does exist that there's only one person that provides something, and this is that exception, and if only one person provides it, you don't have to go through the competitive process. But the protections for the district are in the second part of this paragraph that are highlighted, which is number one, it has to be approved by either the executive director of finance or the purchasing manager. So working together with the people that want to buy it, they have to basically convince these people, and they have that veto power. But rather than just exercising the veto power, what has been happening, similar to the education equipment, materials, and services, is they've said, okay, you say that's the sole source, that's the only one of its kind from this one vendor. Let me post it and see if anyone else brings forth something that meets it. And lo and behold, we're finding out that what we thought was sole source really isn't, and the other people that are coming in often do so with comparable or better prices or different options that the district may favorably consider. This last one, I haven't highlighted anything. This is sort of a extremely rare catch-all, but we want to keep it in the policy. And basically, this is just that if either the superintendent or the executive director of finance make a determination, or the Board of Education for purchases over $250,000, that it's in the district's best interest not to go through the competitive process, we can do it. And I can give you one example. This doesn't happen very much at all, but I can give you one recent example of what would apply to that, and that is in our litigation. We just had a hearing a couple weeks ago in our litigation over our bond issue, and we hired an expert witness. And we did it because we thought we were getting the best, most knowledgeable person in the state of Colorado regarding public finance. That would be an exception. When you're talking about a $375 million bond issue, you want the best, not the cheapest, for your expert witness. That's why that person was selected here, and this would probably be a district best interest exception that would apply. Now, there's one exception, just one, that is an exception not only to the purchasing procedures I just talked about, but also the purchasing authority, the dollar amount, and that's with respect to emergencies. Best example I can give of that is in 2013, we had a lot of flooding in the district and at Cache La Poudre Elementary School, and I think this actually happened over a weekend when some of that happened. There was flooding at the school, so emergency mitigation procedures were necessary not only to prevent mold, but to prevent the flooding from getting worse and having more damage at the school. So emergency purchases were made, but there's protections in place with respect to those. So ServPro, I think, was the vendor that was used, and they came in and got right on it and basically salvaged a lot of things that if they hadn't been able to get involved right away might have gotten worse. But what happens after that is in the highlighted portions at the end of this, and these are protections to the district. The first thing is an emergency purchase requisition has to be filled out, and that has to include a written explanation of the emergency, what was done, and why. After that, that is reviewed by Dave Montoya, the Executive Director of Finance, who then reports on that to either the Superintendent or the Board of Education, depending on the dollar amount involved. So this is an exception, but there are protections there to make sure that it isn't abused. Only thing I want to say about grievances here, any decisions regarding who we award a contract to can be grieved, and the person who makes the initial investigation and decision on that is the purchasing manager. The purchasing manager's decision can be appealed first to the Executive Director of Finance, then to the Superintendent, and if it involves a purchase of over $250,000, the board can, if it wants, take the appeal from the superintendent, or if it thinks that the superintendent has made a good decision and the board doesn't need to spend its time on it, the board can say we're going to stand on the superintendent's appeal decision. So the board has a choice. Quickly moving over to the two construction policies, and then if there's any questions, either I or the people that we have here might be able to answer them. This language that's highlighted at the top of policy FE is also at the top of policy FEAA. And basically what this says is, what I've told you earlier, is that the purchasing policies that I've talked about earlier, plus policy DJG, DJGA, which concerns vendor relations, sales calls, and demonstrations, these purchasing policies apply to all construction project purchases unless otherwise provided in the construction policies. So everything I've said about purchasing policies applies to construction unless otherwise stated in these policies. And then the definition of construction project is also in this first paragraph language, and that's important because these construction policies apply not only to new build, but also to additions, remodels, retrofits, and even infrastructure installation. That can be things like drainage ditches and culverts and stuff. So it applies to all of this. something Bill Franzine touched on when he was addressing the board is this language at this first paragraph here in Policy FE, the slide that we have currently up, and that is that the Director of Planning, Design, and Construction is required to establish administrative guidelines for developing the design not only of new facilities but also of additions to existing facilities. And you can see items A through E there. These are the sort of things that are supposed to be included within her administrative guidelines. And then I want to emphasize at the end of that, in addition to those specifics, things like spatial relationships, drawings and specifications that have been developed for similar projects in the past, and so forth, in addition to that, she's required to take into account the input from the people who will be using the new facility. And that includes not only district staff, but also students and members of the community. So input on everyone is sought regarding the public buildings that the public will be using. At the end of the second paragraph, I've highlighted a portion that basically talks about two important things in construction projects. The first one is methods of construction that will be used. And I thought Tammy Knauer did a really good job a few months ago of explaining to the board not only what each of these three items is, but under what circumstances she would use one over the other. I'm not going to repeat that now, but this is nothing new either. These two construction policies, I think Ed Holder talked about when we were developing this is what we're doing anyhow. So this describes the actual process. We have the traditional design bid build process, we have the CMGC process, and then the cost of work plus a fee. There's also three types of contract award involved, and no surprise there, they're exactly the same as in the purchasing policies. We either have price quote comparison, competitive bidding, or competitive proposals. So that's how construction contracts are awarded, and that's how it's determined, the method. As I talked about before also, this highlighted portion in the middle of the first paragraph, legal counsel approves the form of the contract, which is the modified AIA, and then either the facilities department or the planning, design, and construction department uses those pre-approved contract forms depending on the type of construction and the construction delivery process that's used, and just fills in the missing information. The last paragraph again tracks with what we talked about in the purchasing policies. The planning, design, and construction department or facilities department. There's an awful lot of construction project work that the facilities department does, but it's smaller stuff and it's more in the nature of remodel, retrofit, and repair type as opposed to new build. That's what planning, design, and construction does. But they're supposed to work cooperatively with the purchasing department just like anyone else doing purchasing, and the division of duties is essentially same. The purchasing department will handle the procedures and facilitate those, and either PD&C or facilities will concentrate on the method of construction, working with the contractors, design of the building, those sorts of things. Finally, the last part of the policy FE, and there were some questions on this, after I go through FEAA, we may want to come back to this, but this has to do with fee amendments, which are basically additional costs, changes to an underlying contract with a design professional, like an architect, or change orders, which is changing the construction contract with a contractor. And basically what this policy said, and this is one that's been in place in the district for a decade or more, is that the original contract dollar amount, planning, design, and construction can approve with the protections that I'll describe here, change orders or fee amendments up to 20% of the original contract amount. And that's essentially something that's approved if it's a big contract. That is implicit in the board approving the contract amount with this policy having been in place for 10 years or more. 10 years is as long as I am aware of this current language, but I think it's been in place longer. The board is also implicitly approving the change orders. But the protections that are in place for that are that for every change order and every fee amendment, a purchase order has to be obtained from the purchasing department. So there's a check and balance involved there. It's not just planning, design, and construction that on its own makes the decision to issue a change order. They have to go through purchasing and do that. And then with whether it's new build construction or the sort of summer remodel and retrofit work, the Board of Education's aware that periodic reports are given, and information on change orders is something that can and should be part of those reports so that the information gets back to the board on that. I will say that my experience, and in talking to Dave Montoya, I think he agrees, and I'd certainly invite input from Tammy and Ed, but I think that this district does an outstanding job compared to many districts I work with before I came in-house here of keeping change orders down. That is not something that I'm aware of this district having a problem with, and I think what that goes into the good work at the front end that facilities and planning, design, and construction do in getting the project right in the first place. But when we're talking about the percentage of the base contract that change orders are authorized before, I want to emphasize that that's in the aggregate. It's going to be rare that you're going to have one big change order for that amount, and in fact I think it's somewhat rare that you're going to have several change orders that aggregate up to that amount. That's the maximum that you have to, or once you go over that 20%, then you have to go back to the person who originally approved it. Last thing real quickly is policy FEAA. This policy concerns nothing but construction project pre-qualifications. I described to you earlier what the pre-qualification is, and the highlighted portion at the bottom of this slide basically emphasizes that you pre-qualify for two basic things: different types of projects and different sizes of projects. There's some contractors, for example, that just don't have adequate capitalization or bonding capacity to do a big project, or they don't have the experience or expertise to do it. So both the size of the project and the type. There may be some projects that a person can do, some that they can't. That's something that planning, design, and construction and facilities determine in advance. They don't have to, but they can. This is permissive, not mandatory. If facilities or planning, design, and construction chooses to pre-qualify a contractor or architect or construction manager, whoever, that pre-qualification lasts for 5 years. So the top of this slide indicates that they shall be pre-qualified at least once every 5 years. And that doesn't mean that's the only time someone gets pre-qualified. Basically what that says is that's how long the pre-qualification lasts. This last paragraph, or the last part of this paragraph that's highlighted, emphasizes two things, and that is what the purpose of pre-qualification is and what the purpose of pre-qualification is not. And I've already said the purpose of pre-qualification is to streamline the process so the person that the district ultimately selects to do the project, they know in advance that they're qualified, so they don't have to worry about the fact that, gee, the price is good. Can they do this? Do we know anything about them? Have they done it before? All those questions have been answered already. That's the only purpose of pre-qualification. As the last sentence of this paragraph points out, pre-qualification shall not be used to award a contract without the required procedures for price quotes, competitive bidding, or competitive proposals. So for example, just because you have a pool of pre-qualified people, you're not done. You can draw from that pool to invite them to submit bids or proposals or something, or quotes, but you can't just pick them based on your preference there. That just means they're qualified. It doesn't mean they're picked. Two last things real quick. With respect to design professionals and construction managers, the criteria that go into determining whether or not they will be pre-qualified are set out in the bullet points on this slide. And the only bullet point that I want to call particular attention to is the first one. There is actually an AIA document, this B305, which applies to design professionals, and that has a lot of important consideration that goes into determining whether or not someone should be pre-qualified. And then these remaining bullets are basically things that are unique to school districts that Poudre School District in particular may want to consider. Similarly, and this is the last slide that I want to emphasize, with respect to contractors, we do the same thing. We have criteria that have to be considered as part of the pre-qualification process, and the AIA document for that also applies. Specific information that has to be considered, the A305, the prior one was B305, and then the subsequent bullets are additional considerations that might be unique to school districts and to Poudre School District. There is a last slide, but there's really nothing worth emphasizing there. So at this point, I would, if there are any questions and if people are still awake, I'd invite them, and if I can't answer them, particularly if your questions have to do with implementation or enforcement, I think that the other people, including the superintendent, might be better to answer that than me, but otherwise, ask away.
Nate.
I just have about 10 questions. I wondered how much time we have left for this item.
Oh, about 3 hours. No worries.
Policy, this is all very fascinating, by the way, so thank you for that comprehensive presentation.
I'm sure Todd Lambert will tell me how fascinating it was in great detail tomorrow.
Yeah, probably so. I look forward to the transcript from his description. Policy DJ, I believe. Is there any chance that policy DJ purchasing was approved by the revised by the superintendent on March 8, 2017?
Actually, it was not.
It was not. Okay. So is there a plan for that, for the revision date?
No, it was the last time. You'll notice that the other ones were also reviewed back in and revised back in 2016 as well, which was the last time DJ was revised, March 21, 2016. DJ was looked at, but when we looked at it most recently, we did look at it, but none of those revisions, either the emphasis or the clarification that we were talking about, was determined necessary for that one. So this most recent round, although we looked at it, we didn't make any changes.
Okay, thanks. How common is it, and what kind of controls are in place to deal with purchases made by employees for which they get reimbursed, for which the district ends up having to pay sales tax? How is that monitored or controlled or dealt with?
I don't know that we have good controls over that right now. I'm just going to give you the honest answer. One of the things that the new purchasing manager, Skylar Timmons, has identified is that we need to be looking at those on an annual basis to identify where can we mitigate those sales tax pieces. That is also something that the consultant that I had come in to just identify the gaps in the policies. I think Tom Krebs talked about that also. That was something that they identified as an area that we needed to focus on, is getting some kind of a control process around reimbursements, specifically with the sales tax piece.
Okay.
I believe we will be able to do that by looking at historical transactions and going back and saying, you know, how much sales tax we pay and try to piece that down. I think the other piece of it also is trying to educate the entire system as to what these new policies are and to get them to go through purchasing so that we don't have that sales tax issue to begin with.
Okay, which also, well, one piece on that was, I mean, is there going to be some sort of, do you anticipate that there would be some sort of additional written guidance about that, or what? Or, I mean, do you evaluate it for a year and then come up with something?
I think that this is something that we've talked about, and I just wanted to piggyback on what Dave said, which I think also helps answer your question. There's two things that I think need to be done as a practical matter in those cases, because we are talking about smaller dollar purchases. The two things that need to be done are, number one, training, informing the people. And I think that that's something that the process has already started on, making sure that everyone's aware of this. But the second part is something that I said at the very outset of this presentation, which is accountability. If people have been trained, they know, they've been told, and they're continuing to do it, then that can and probably should become a disciplinary matter. But as a practical matter, more policies, more finger wagging doesn't necessarily make better compliance. I think that training, informing people, giving them a fair opportunity to comply, and then if they either cannot or will not, then have to look at consequences.
The only other thing I was going to add is that, you know, tonight we're talking about the policies, but we also have and need to complete some administrative guidelines that clarify some of that, and that might be somewhere where we get into that sales tax issue a little bit deeper.
Okay, thanks. The other thing is, I was unclear when, Tom, when you were going through all of this, how much of this is new concepts for which training would be required or education would be required, or is it more articulation of practices that most people know about?
I'm going to answer a different question. Which will enlighten you. There's basically nothing substantively new here at all, except for the educator's override on curriculum-type purchases if they don't want to. That's really the only new thing. Everything else, honestly, has been in place for at least a decade. So it is not new, and we have had training over the years that I've been here 11 years. We've had training over the years multiple times. In fact, Sandra Smizer's, I think, very first administrative retreat, one of the things that was done was a presentation on purchasing policies. Not only Gerald Nielsen did one, but I did one. So it's something that's been done right along. I know that office managers and others have been separately trained by people in the finance department. So it's something that's been ongoing, but I think that what we're trying to do now, that we have a contract administrator on board and that we have a new purchasing manager on board, is we're sort of trying to regroup and redouble our efforts to make sure that everyone in the district's aware of these so that we can ensure better compliance. That's how I would answer the question you didn't ask. So it's a combination of both. We are trying to do more training right now, but it's not because this is new. It's because we're trying to get better compliance.
Okay, well, maybe I need to rephrase my question instead of say you didn't answer my question, but yeah, that's what I was getting at. Thank you.
I knew that's what you were getting at.
Christoph.
All right, so now for my 10 questions. So, and I'll start. I'll apologize because I kind of got to the material a little late, so I didn't ask the Picayune stuff in my emails, but here's just a couple. In DJB, under the construction contracts, it says, and I found it again as I was listening to you under in the FE as well. It says, such written contracts shall be reviewed by legal counsel. And I was actually wondering, given the authority we place in our purchasing manager, whether it should be legal counsel and or is it director of purchasing? I'm not sure.
Purchasing manager.
Purchasing
is the
manager,
title.
whether that should, isn't that part of that job description? Isn't that what we hired that position
No.
for? Okay.
It's really not, I think that the skill set of the purchasing manager is really to ride herd on and ensure compliance with and facilitate the procedures, but really contract is a legal thing, and we have not only outside attorneys that sometimes get involved in this stuff. I do an awful lot of contract work myself, and we've recently hired a contract administrator whose job is to review, revise, and write contracts. That really is, it's something that a purchasing manager probably could do, but Dave and I talked a lot about this before Skylar was hired and before Tracy Stibbets was hired, our contract administrator, and we decided that it wasn't fair to either one of them to try and fold those into one job and to separate them out. So it's conscious that that's not part of his job.
Okay. Believe it or not, I guessed that was going to be your answer, but I thought it was worth asking. Another one at this level, and unfortunately, you have to look at where I'm looking at, but under DJB on page 4, there's an instance where it says the purchasing and materials manager, it's getting really picky, but it's not capitalized. And I think from listening to you, you meant in that case the purchasing and materials manager, not any manager who is doing a purchase. And I wondered if that becomes ambiguous when it's not capitalized, or did you intend it to be any manager?
Are you talking about, like, for example, at the first line in the grievance section?
Yes.
The convention, if you look at all of the district policies, a convention that we have in the district, look at the top of that same page. Superintendent and executive director of finance are also not capitalized. The convention we use, and it's simply, you could think of it as an arbitrary rule, but the fact is it's been uniformly applied, is that titles are lowercase, departments are initial caps uppercase.
That's fine. I just was trying to cover any sense of ambiguity. And just to cut to the chase, I'm gonna go broad now and just make a comment and ask a question. So when I became aware that these policies were going to come under review and revision, I will say that I may not be the only one, but I did ponder whether these belong under the board, under the policies for Board of Education. But I feel very confident in my mind that these do belong with our district executive, the superintendent.
These aren't board policies, these are superintendent policies. Oh, okay.
I agree that they remain with the executive,
Okay.
the superintendent. But with that said, I think a number of us have wondered often, how do we know these policies are being implemented and followed? And that would be the question, how might the board monitor these policies so that we have a sense that these are being followed? And that may be a question for the superintendent.
I think that you're exactly right, that it is an appropriate question for the superintendent, but I will say, and I think you and Rob particularly know, that we have an internal auditor, and the internal auditor works pursuant to basically policies that concern the audit committee, and the audit committee policy is a board policy, and the audit committee is a committee that advises the Board of Education, and the internal auditor has been reporting for some time on these types of items. She audits, that's her only job, is to audit the district's financial transaction in compliance with these things and report to the audit committee. Now, that's not the only way to help ensure compliance and all, but that's one way in addition to whatever the superintendent may choose to do administratively.
And I think that's appropriate. The only thing that's come to my mind is that because it's not a board policy, we will not get a monitoring report on it.
Well, actually, that is something that's covered. Dave's up next, and that is in, I think it's EL 2.6, is asset protection, and that is something that's always been covered by that. So stay tuned. You'll hear about just how well we're doing.
Rob, did you say you had questions as well? Other questions, comments? Okay, I have observed while Tom was giving his great speech on all of the great changes that have been made, that the people in this room who worked with him on those changes, because I know it wasn't just Tom, I think the folks from planning, design, and construction, the folks from purchasing, Dave, that there's been a lot of head nodding going on. I know you guys spent an awful lot of time getting together and working on these. I just wanted to let you know I really appreciate it, and I really appreciate that we've been able to come to a better place, I think, than we have been in the recent past, so that we can most effectively use our tax dollars, which we're entrusted with. So thank you.